Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, whatever works for you to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just a quick introduction myself and my co-host here, Ohad. We are my name's John Daniel, and we are, and my co-host, sorry, is Ohad Adan. We are the co-leaders for the Richmond, Virginia area Salesforce Developer User Group. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Daniel Ballinger, all the way from New Zealand, and I will let him talk about his background. But we are so excited to have you here, sir, and thank you very much for your time. I would ask, just for a couple of ground rules, everybody please stay muted. We will have a Q&A session after Daniel finishes up with his presentation. And with that, Daniel, please take it away.
Great, thank you. So yes, I'm Daniel Ballinger. I am the Apex product manager. I've been in that role for about a year, just under a year, working with Chris Peterson. I think he did a presentation to the same user group about a year ago. Mm-hmm. Prior to working in this role, I've been an Apex developer and for ISV, putting apps in the App Exchange. I did that for over 10 years. So I've written a lot of Apex code myself previously. I have done a number of things in the community in the past. I've been a Salesforce MVP prior to joining Salesforce for about 5 or 6 years. I've done a number of projects. Probably the one that people most know me for is the key prefix lookup. If you ever go to Google, you're likely, and you search for a key prefix, you're likely to find my blog, which is fisherprey.com. You can also find me on Twitter at fisherprey.com. I've done other things over the years. I've done things with the metadata dependency API and visualizing those, presentations to Dreamforce on that, extensions to the enterprise security API library for using security strip and accessible. I think I did a self-driving car using Einstein Vision. So I've done a lot of things around the Apex community. I've been all over the place for there. Yeah, so that's me. And today, before I get started, and it wouldn't be a product manager talk without this very special slide, and we will be talking about some things that are currently in beta and pilot. So it's important to remember that Salesforce is a publicly traded company, and that customers should base their purchasing decisions on products and services that are currently available. I think that slide is getting longer. Right. So today we will talk about user mode database operations, what that is, why it's important for all Apex developers, Dataweave and Apex. If we've got some time, we'll talk about some other developments that are coming with Apex, probably mostly around what's on the roadmap. And as we said at the end, we can do some Q&A. So user mode database operations. But I think before we get into that too far, it's probably useful to talk about where we're at today, what the current scenario is, and then we can go over the design overview, how it's going to work, what are some of the scope and limitations of this feature, and then we'll jump into a couple of demo use cases to see how it actually works in practice. So Apex today, when you run something in Apex, it would execute in what we would typically call system mode. And what that means is you get a lot more flexibility than what a current user would typically otherwise have. So you would be able to do, and this is important. So obviously, if a user has access to an object or its fields, that's fine. But in Apex, we can go above and beyond that. And you can write code that could talk to, that could update, delete S objects and their fields that the user wouldn't otherwise have access to. This is important if you're doing something like a business process that needs to update the discount on an opportunity or prices on fields. It might be that the user doesn't have that level of access, but in code and the business process, it makes perfect sense to do that. So that's what system mode is. And that actually puts a great deal of responsibility. I've butchered that quote there, but I think that's a better one. It puts a lot of pressure on the Apex developer that they are now responsible for enforcing the security model in a lot of scenarios to make sure that it's respected. there's a lot of querying the schema and things like that to see what is and isn't allowed. So what did that actually look like historically? Well, if you take something simple like, say, the SOCL statement to say, I've got a field, I want some basic fields from the account object. How would we actually implement that? Especially if you're an ISV and you needed to go to App Exchange Security Review. How would you actually package, or how would you write that Apex code to actually allow you to enforce the security model? Well, it gets quite complicated, especially if you're using historical describe calls. You need to check access for the account object, and then you need to start looking at each and every field that's selected in that SOCL statement. So do I have access to the name field? Do I have access to the owner ID field? Oh, the owner ID field is a polymorphic lookup. Do I have access to the user object that's referenced by that? And there's actually examples on here. You could expand that out, like, well, do I have access to the name on that? This example is account. If we were doing the same ownership check from case being a polymorphic ownership lookup, could be owned by a user or a group. So if you could imagine this here expanding out quite fast. Now, I mean, this is the simplest sort of case of a SOCL statement. You can imagine this can get very verbose to expand out and enforce properly. And then, of course, if there's any change to the SOCL statement, you've got to go find all these statements and update them as well. So potentially error prone, quite hard to maintain. And then that's not even talking about dynamic SOCL, which is, again, those statements can require even more describe calls to try and keep them track of them all. So back around 2010, Salesforce released the Salesforce Enterprise Security API, and that was kind of to address some of those challenges. And there are other libraries that do this, both public ones like the Financial Forces FFlib, and there's also Patron Text DML Manager, and they sort of abstract away a lot of that complexity, but they don't do it. I mean, it's not free. They're still doing the describe calls. They will, on cases, sometimes need to make extra SOCL calls or cache a lot of metadata to be able to do that enforcement for you. This is one of the goals we're looking for. Security strip and accessible helps with that a little bit. But with user mode, our goal is to actually address that particular use case of those, to say, if you're trying to mimic user mode, well, user mode is the better way to do it. And so we're aiming to make those sort of features obsolete. More recently, there's been updates to the Salesforce security model, so the security features in Apex that would help address some of these issues. There's security with security enforced clause for SOCL. That's quite simple in its nature, and it gives you a very easy way to say enforce the security model, make sure we get access to those fields and records. It does have some limitations. It won't go to where clauses or order by clauses and look at the fields there. The alternative and slightly newer version of that is security strip and accessible. That's obviously a lot more flexible because it's more than just SOCL queries. It'll cover most of your GML operations and input from other untrusted sources like JavaScript from your browser or something. So that's a lot more, it gives you a lot more flexibility in how you want to deal with those things. There's still some things it doesn't support, like aggregate queries, and it can be quite verbose dealing with security strip and accessible if you need to start looking at each and every thing it returns, but it is quite flexible. So that brings us to today and what we're aiming for with Summer 22 with a beta of user mode database operations. So if we look at what we started with before, how would that look if we had, if we addressed that with user mode? Well, rather than wrapping with all the described calls or with a security strip and accessible, we've just added a new with clause, which is with user mode. It's very similar to how with security enforce is done syntactically, but under the hood, it's actually a lot more performant because it's natively running as the user would, which is very similar to how, say, like an API call would occur. So it's not iterating through all the fields and saying, do I have access to this? Do I have access to that? It is just natively enforcing that. So the performance is higher in terms of checking that. The other part of that is, and this is something that with security enforced doesn't really give you, is we've added some new methods to the exceptions that might come out of that. So we're quite aware with security strip and accessible, I think, was it Chuck Liddell brought this up and sort of helped refine the design of that. It's like, as an ISV, and I know this happens, if the very first thing that if that exception happens and one of your subscriber will report that the problem, they're saying, okay, what do I need to do to actually clear the security? What permissions or permission sets do I need to give to the user so they can actually get past this? And it's really important here to be able to say, oh, this is the complete set of S objects or S object fields that you need access to. And that's what this, this new method is for. It will actually, it's keyed by the S objects and it gives you the list of fields for those S objects that the user didn't have access to. And then the other key part of this is, yeah, it's supposed to be minimal additional syntax. So you can tack that on without having to make significant changes to your existing SOQL queries. We will aiming at making it packageable, but it won't be full GA yet. So it won't be supported for App Exchange. As a beta product, it wouldn't have full App Exchange support. That is something we're still working on. And by the time we get to GA, that will be coming. Now, it's obviously not just for SOQL queries. So there's a direct native support for it using the as user syntax you can see here. And there's a couple of variations on that. So the most basic version is just a drop in. You can add 2 keywords to your existing DML statements, obviously for individual S objects or collections. And it will make your intent quite clear that I wanted this to run as a user mode operation. If you wanted more flexibility, there is also the database insert methods or all the other database DML variations. And they support things, and that's parameterized, so you can control that as required. And they support your existing DML options, either as the Boolean or via the DML options. When you do use DML options, like the all or none, that can change the way we report the exception, the errors. Like obviously, if it's all or none true, we're going to throw an exception, and you'll have to look to the exception for the differences there. If it's all or none false, you're going to look at like the results from that and the individual errors there. There's a counterpart, there's an opposite of user mode, is obviously system mode, and we've added explicit syntax to that. That will still be the current default for Apex, but if you wanted to make your intent clear, there is specific syntax that you can use both on direct statements or within even the SOQL queries. You can include that there as well. There are some limitations, and Scope will go over those. So within a single statement, like a single SOQL statement or a single DML statement, you can't mix user mode and system mode together. That doesn't really make any sense. They're mutually exclusive. And for similar reasons, you can't use user mode with security enforced, because user mode supersedes everything security enforced does and does it better. So we don't allow you to combine those two. If you're running an execute anonymous script, you can't use it to boost yourself into system mode. That's one of the exceptions with Apex, is that execute anonymous actually runs in something closer to user mode natively, unless it's calling out to other classes. So there are restrictions there that you can't access them that the user wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. As with security enforced, you can only use it in Apex directly. You can't add it to SOQL queries like those coming in through the APIs. If you're writing a SOQL query, you must define, well, you can only define the user mode or system level mode at the top level of that SOQL query. So you can't jump down to subqueries within it and then alter it there. It's an all or nothing for the entire query. In system mode, the with sharing or without sharing or inheritance sharing from the class definition applies. The second you switch into user mode, it is always with sharing because it's as the user would see it. They can't escalate above that. I think I already talked briefly about all or none, and that alters the way both for SOCL and for DML, how we report those errors, whether we do it through the exception or through the corresponding class that gets returned. There's some other nice features about user mode. It will work for things like field standard. That's actually one of the examples I'll show. It'll also work for aggregate functions and enforce the fields that the user can see across that. I made this table. It's quite large and complex, but it sort of shows like you've now got quite a large tool belt of things you could use to address security issues, depending on what you wanted to do. But trying to steer you more towards the two parts at the bottom now than some of the historic things. Obviously, with sharing, without sharing, and inherit sharing still apply at the class level. But going forward, we see user mode database operations as an easier and more complete way of enforcing security. So things like with security enforced, not so applicable anymore. If you did want a lot more flexibility in how you handle the errors, say you wanted to just omit things that the user didn't have access to, then security strip and accessible is a good option for that one. Is there any other key points here? I think, yeah, then the other key point is that, yeah, user mode database operations is faster. It's not doing redundant field level security or CRUD checks on top of the system mode escalation because it is literally user mode. Right, so we shall do a demo, find the correct one for user mode, and sharing it. Now, I thought for demos, we could run through some actual test cases. We actually have quite a large suite because the number of permutations around this is large, and I'll let that run while I talk through them, just so you can know I'm still not just smoke and mirrors. This is running on the pilot version of user mode, so you won't. Some of the syntax will look a little bit different, but it's the same general idea. So in this test case, we've inserted an account, and here I've used one of my favorite features of recently, which is the minimum access profile. When you're writing test cases like this is hugely beneficial because I don't have to go and revoke a bunch of things or find some weird field. I just create all my test users as a minimum access user and then grant them what they actually need. So we have a user with basically access to nothing. I've already inserted an account. And if we run as that user, can I get rid of those to give you a bit more view? There we go. If we run as that user, you'll see in system mode, I can find that account, no problem. All these asserts passed. I hope everybody saw. I ran this test, they all passed. So whatever I'm showing you here is to be taken as actually ran. So, but that user, if you had looked at the described results, didn't have access to the account or the fields on it. If I did that same query as user mode, here you can see what's actually the pilot syntax. This will be going away and you'd be able to do it as native support come beta. Run the same query, we actually get a query exception. There's no, you don't have access to the account object. Now this expands to specific fields, as I mentioned before, like if we use field standard expansion, if you actually tried to work out how to do that with describe calls to support field standard, you start to have to list out a lot of fields. It can get quite complicated. And if Salesforce adds a new standard field, you're going to have to adapt to that as well. Whereas in this case, again, we've just inserted an account, taken that same user with no access. Here, I've given that user specific permissions via a permission set to create, edit, and read account objects. And then in system mode, you'll see if I run that query on the account, I can actually get the annual revenue that I inserted above here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, I think, 5. So system mode will happily bring that data back. But if I do the same query as user mode, it doesn't even get annual revenue as a field. Field standard doesn't expand to include the annual revenue field because the user doesn't have access to that field. The other example here, this one gets a bit more complicated. So again, we've inserted the account, we've set 2 fields on it. Again, we've given the minimum access user permission to work with account objects, but they don't have access to those fields. So system mode will happily bring them out. You could work with those fields if you want. User mode will get a query exception. And this was that new method I was talking about earlier. So as an ISV, if I have to go to someone and say, no, you didn't have access to run that, they're going to say, well, what access did I need? Well, I can say, you need access to the account object. And on that account object, you need access to the annual revenue field because it will be in that set collection. And you need access to the website field. Billing country is an interesting one. In the underlying model, SOCL actually expands the billing fields out into billing address. So in that case, it will say, and then I think when you grant permissions on the user interface, like in the UI, you actually grant access to billing address. You can't individually break out those fields. So it will actually tell you need access to billing address. Yep, that was that one. Slide. So that pretty much covered, that's like a whirlwind tour of user mode. The other thing I wanted to talk about is DataWeave, which is a feature we're working on to get towards beta. Oh, we'll cover that in the roadmap section. But it would be useful to go over what was our motivation for that, what do we see the use cases for DataWeave as being, how we've designed it. Again, the same sort of thing, what the scope and limitations, and we could look at an example of that as well. So what is DataWeave? DataWeave's the transformation language that's built into MuleSoft, and that's what they use to read and parse data from one data source, transform it in some manner, and then export it out in another format. And it's specifically designed for that purpose, and it can be quite succinct at that. It's probably best shown with an example. So this is how you can, the middle script there is the actual DataWeave script. There's a great website, dwlang.fun, where you can experiment with how DataWeave scripts input, process input and output. But you see on the left there, we've got a JSON script, JSON file with just some basic contact information. And we've said in our DataWeave script here, okay, the inbound payload is JSON. I want you to output that as CSV without headers. And when you execute that script, that's exactly what you get, is flattens that down into a CSV. I didn't have to deal with the specifics of the file formats or how they should be read or iterating through the items. It just does that for me. In terms of how you could use this from Apex, there's a few there's a few scenarios that are particularly relevant. One I've dealt with myself, which is trying to write an RFC compliant CSV parser. You would think CSV is quite a simple format, but to do so in a compliant way, when you start dealing with new line characters or escaped double quotes in Apex, can become quite CPU and heap intensive. And by the time you parse the file, you might not have much leftover capacity to actually do something with the data, which is where something like DataWeave comes in and will handle that parsing for you and transformation potentially. So you can focus more on the actual interesting parts of the problems than just the specifics of the file format. There's other things there around our JSON serialization and deserialization, both with the reserved keywords. I'm sure people have run into that, where you have to in your Apex class, put an _x or something on it, and then manipulate strings to try and get the JSON. Chris is smiling. Yeah, trying to get those to line up properly. Whereas DataWeave doesn't have those limitations. It can format dates as it needs through the transformations, or it can just output the objects without having to take into account reserved keywords for Apex. And then you get your similar sorts of scenarios like, well, if I'm serializing an S object, probably we don't want the __C suffixes on all the fields. Those are common scenarios. At the time of the pilot, the way you use DataWeave scripts in Apex is generally you have a dedicated metadata file, which contains the script. You will deploy that with the metadata API. Coming up will be support for the SFDX CLI push as well. So just push that like any other piece of metadata. Then to actually use that script from within Apex, you would reference it by script name. In the future, we'll probably add direct support so that the script name would be like an instance of a class that you could instantiate. But right now, it's just by name. And then once you've got the instance of your DataWeave script, you can just execute it. You'll notice there's some parameters. Those are the inputs for the DataWeave script that it will do the transform on. Currently, you can get the values out as a string. We're also looking at exploring how to expand that out directly to objects in Apex, so you wouldn't have to do an intermediate step of transforming those. So currently, as I mentioned, the DataWeave scripts are static resources. Oh, it's not static resources, that's actually right. They're metadata files. They're static metadata files that are deployed through the metadata API. We did consider execution of dynamic data scripts, but that's a big security issue with code that could potentially modify code. It's not really something we can support. There's other parts of DataWeave that are disabled for equal security reasons, like DataWeave's ability to bridge into Java. We can't have it reading environment variables or things like that. It's isolated into a sandbox, basically. When you execute your DataWeave scripts, they would be considered part of your Apex heap and CPU limits within reason. So there's no unlimited processing power from a DataWeave script. But because of its nature as a dedicated transform language, once you pass like a trivial example of a few lines of code, a few lines of data to process, it starts to really be a lot more efficient in that respect, because that's what it's designed to do. It's important to note that you don't need to be a MuleSoft customer to use this product. It would be a native part of Apex. So it's independent of that. We did expand Apex with some dedicated, such as DataWeave script exceptions, so you can see, catch and process them as applicable. And if you use DataWeave's native logging, that will be exposed in Apex as well through the normal debug log with a dedicated category. So have a look at demo of that. It's in the right place. So again, I thought it'd be easiest to do it through a test class, and I can show you again that it is indeed actually running. So in this case, we have a CSV file with some columns, a whole bunch of data. There's things in here that would have made this hard to parse, well, more challenging to parse. We've got double quotes, escape double quotes. We've got new lines within one row of data that are escaped. So you can't just do a straight string split on a new line character. So what the test case does here, it just loads that CSV from a static resource. And this gets into how we apply the DataWeave script. Which might be useful, but I'll show you that script first. So DataWeave script, we've got some standard header stuff for a script. this will say I have a CSV incoming and I would like some JSON out. I expect my input data to be in the parameter in data. For the data that comes in for each row, rename the key, put it in the JSON and put the value next to it. So we can see here that we've taken some of the column names that might have been problematic when we were loading contact records. We actually wanted mailing, city, street, etc. We've transformed them with very little effort. I don't have to do a row by row processing. It's just going to map it over for me. So I load my script, which was CSV to JSON. That's just some validation that we've actually got the right script. So data here, I think, data is just the static resource CSV. I'm going to pass straight in. And then I've got the result of the JSON. I've got the JSON result out. In this case, just to prove that it is doing what I wanted it to do, I deserialize that and I can go through and say, like, here is that multi-lined example of the JSON. So I haven't had to deal with any of the specifics of how to parse the CSV, what the encoding was. It's just transformed it directly for me. And I've got the mailing street, etc., straight out of the CSV data. There's other things, because it's DataWeave's got more support for those formats. Say somebody gave me a file that was semicolon delimited rather than comma delimited. Well, for me, that's not actually much of a big deal. I have a different static resource. Find it. There is that one. In that case, all I'm really having to do is say, define the separator on the data in DataWeave, and it will handle that for me. So I haven't had to actually do any effort to support that different format. Whereas my tests haven't run yet. I don't think my Scratch will have expired, but it's still running. You just have to take my word that those do in fact pass. We can come back to that later.
Daniel, I noticed there was full syntax highlighting on your Dataweave script.
Yeah, that was something that they have done. There is a nice Visual Studio extension. Where is it? I'm trying to remember what it was called. It's literally called Dataweave 2.0. And I think, yeah, that gave me some really nice support, so I didn't have to made writing the Dataweave scripts a lot easier because I get my nice highlighting and everything. And
you can even run it locally through that plugin, right?
Can you? I have not tried that.
I'm pretty sure that's what defined sample data is for.
Ooh. Do we try it live?
Depends how bold you feel.
Maybe we could come back to that later if people really want to see it. What happens when I push that button? My test might have finished and we can push that button and see what happens. That would be interesting. Why not? Let's do it live. So where are we at with these? So user mode database operations is currently in pilot. In the next release, summer 22, we're looking at a public beta. As I mentioned before, there will be some limitation. It will be packageable, but there'll be some limitations around using it in App Exchange security review. And then aiming to bring that to full GA by spring 23. DataWeave, we're looking to have a public dev preview in winter 23. So that's after summer 22. It's always confusing. It's much easier when we work in internal numbers, especially with seasons. For me being in the Southern Hemisphere, this really does my head in. So yeah, so there's those two things. We're working through those. The public dev preview will likely be Scratch orgs only, so you can get in and try it. That's part of it being a dev preview. There's other things that we're currently exploring, such as switch on constants. In fact, we're discussing that today around how if you had a constant, you could safely switch on it and not get compile issues. That's something we're working through, and I'll actually be going out to the community people in the near-term future to look at exploring how that works. We're also looking at adding a null coalescing operator to complement the safe navigation operator, just for better null handling there. Something I've also recently been looking at is how we could expand queuables and the in-queuing behavior around timing between when you enqueued and when the next job runs. There's some nuance there around people and balancing that with where scheduled Apex currently works. Trying to get each job working towards its better use case, with queuables being more scalable and having the transaction finalizer for things with quite small timing requirements. As a larger thing with other teams, we're also working with the flow team. So if you want to work with your annotated Apex methods from flow design tools, that they'll come through faster and cleaner. Looking longer term in the future of Apex, I know with user mode, there's thoughts around how we can make user mode the default rather than system mode. And then if you want to explicitly expand something to system mode, you do it explicitly. And then there's also thoughts around using permission set escalation for user mode. So if you had, so take the permissions of the current user and augment them with a permission set, make it a lot cleaner around what permissions you actually wanted that user to have. One of our larger long-term roadmap items is support for anonymous inner classes. So things like if you had a comparable interface and you wanted to have an implementation of that to control sorting in just one specific class, you could do so with an anonymous inner class. You wouldn't have to have a separate class. You could keep that behavior in line. And there's also some larger refinements coming to Apex testing for how we can improve the speed of getting through those test cases, because obviously we require tests and code coverage. And so it's a long part of the developer lifecycle. So making some refinements to improve that. If there is any feedback on those things, those are probably the best URLs to start with, or you could reach me on Twitter. Always interested in how people are wanting to use those tools, what gaps they see in them. That's either feedback. I mean, Chris is here. So, actually, before we get to the Q&A, tomorrow there is a Salesforce Devs Ask Me Anything session. So if you have any questions, you can turn up tomorrow and ask my boss, Chris. He's going to be there. Well, no, we can get to some questions today. we won't push them off to Chris. Yeah, so that's tomorrow. And I think it actually happens every month. But that's a great resource if you want to get to that. I think it'll be on, yeah, well, the details are there. And there is also, for the people who are actually in the Washington, DC area, there is a boot camp happening. Yeah, details are there. There's there's actually several sessions going on, lots of role-based tracks, and then there's on-site certification. So if you are in that actual area, it could be a good thing to get to. Cool. Thank you. Or should we actually go back to do the actual Q&A? Yeah.
Yeah,
Probably a good idea.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that came through in the chat. Charles was asking, will it be possible for SOQL to be set to user system mode via database query method param instead? Say like database.query, my query, and then access level user mode.
Yeah, that's in there.
Yeah,
it's in there.
Yeah,
we didn't show it in the slide.
Yeah.
So the one catch there, Charles and others, is you can't contradict yourself. So you can't say with user mode and then specify system mode as the argument. And the two forms exist for a really weird reason, which is we wanted to give you something that was really easy to do as like a separate argument without doing string manipulation, which is why we have the method overload on database.query. So you can at runtime determine which mode you want to be in and make it really explicit. You can make your code really easy to read. But there's a problem with that. The square bracket notation on SOQL queries. There's no way to overload that and pass in an extra parameter, which is why we put the with clause syntax in there, is so you could still make use of square bracket queries because they do a whole bunch of useful things for you in terms of schema validation and change protection. But we also wanted to give you the more expressive method overload version. So if they seem a little bit, if it seems a little strange to have both of them, that's why.
But yes, you will get exceptions. Well, depending on where we detect it. Obviously, if it's a database query, then you'll get a runtime exception. Whereas if you try and put both statements into a square bracket clause and compile it, you will get a compile exception.
Yep.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, Charles is asking another question. Will it be possible in a without sharing context to query with sharing, but still ignore FLS?
User mode, if you go into, like, so if the class is without sharing and you do a user mode operation, it will enforce sharing. It won't run without sharing. If you wanted without sharing and to ignore field level security, that sounds more like system mode and maybe augmented with security strip inaccessible.
No, so the scenario I'm talking about is you have a class that is overall operating without sharing, but within that class, you do need to run some queries that respect whether the user can see the records or not. However, business logic wise, you still want them to be able to query every field that it requests and ignore FLS. So under that scenario, what I would do right now typically is create a little inner class that is explicitly with sharing within that without sharing context. So I can invoke that and de-escalate privilege to run that query. But so I was asking about that use case because it seems that right now, this type of user mode de-escalation of privilege would go deeper than that scenario needs. And so
it would. Your current solution is the right solution for what you're doing. Because you want to bypass FLS and CRUD, user mode isn't the right choice for you.
Okay, makes sense.
And it's important to say, like, we're not taking away your existing options. This is, we want to make it really easy to do the right thing, and emulating user mode yourself is a heinously complex operation. So we want to make it easy to do the right thing. We want to make it performant to do the right thing. We want to handle the weird database centric edge cases where trying to emulate FLS and CRUD in Apex doesn't necessarily work. Like polymorphic lookups gets really, really weird really fast. But we're not taking away system mode, and we're not taking away the type of options that you're talking about. So this is a new tool for your arsenal that does the right thing in a whole lot of cases, but absolutely not all of them.
That makes sense. I feel like there could still potentially be the space to also introduce like a, effectively a with sharing type user mode where it basically behaves, where you explicitly force it to run with sharing and not with FLS. And I just say that because that's a useful mode switching to do in the kind of like business logic operations where business logic dictates you must be able to manipulate field A, B, and C in a trigger, but you do need to determine for various reasons whether the records you're getting actually have user access.
One thing that's worth considering is there is the max record access or record access. I forget which, it's a pseudo field that
user
every record has.
Record access, yeah.
So user record access is the S object you can query, but on every object, you can also query the user, I think it's max record access.
Yeah, I'm aware of that one. I've found it to be extremely flaky. Like if I try where x.user record access equals true, that doesn't always behave predictably. And I've also found that attempting to apply .user record access on like parent queries gives flat out the wrong answer. So I don't trust user record access right now.
I would love to see a couple examples of it, but it sounds like your current solution is the right one for right now.
Okay.
Valid feature request. I mean this with 100% sincerity. Post an idea because we go through those for quality of life stuff. And that's, I think, the bucket this fits into. It's not a fundamental redesign. It doesn't really open any doors, but if people are interested in it, we can absolutely do some syntactic sugar and things like that.
Okay. I will make a note of that for the next time I actually have the time to do it. I'm absolutely certain that I've attempted to implement user record access and ran into situations where the response it gave was flat out wrong, and I actually had to rework because it was so wrong. So
I know the right people to harass over that if there's a good example, and I would love to do so.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Awesome. Dan asked a question, have you given any thought to a security mode based on namespace? For example, a package would have system mode access to all the fields it defines, but user mode access to all other fields like standard objects.
It kind of, in my head, that kind of fits more into the permission set side of things. Like if we augmented it with a permission set, your package could include a permission set that says, here are all the fields in my package. And then when you run that code in the managed package, you run with the escalation. I mean, obviously we're not there yet, but that would be a good fit for that type of scenario.
Absolutely. Ship a permission set that says everything in my package, and then never use system mode, only use user mode plus permission set. Now, we haven't built that yet, so we can't tell you to do it, but that's absolutely the type of thing that the permission set escalation is trying to do, is make it so you can do a bounded escalation instead of an unbounded escalation.
I will look forward to that. It sounds awesome.
We think we fixed all the fundamental platform internals that were holding us back from it. That was, if you remember, we did it like 2 years on a critical update to fix a bunch of those. Yeah, that was enjoyable. And now we get to reap the fruit and actually ship some features on top of it that do security right, and don't get it wrong.
But, yeah, I'll put you down as a vote for yes for permission set escalation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hey, I already beat up Cheryl Feldman. She's on board, so we shouldn't have too much trouble.
Yeah.
It makes security reviews so much easier.
That was a big part of it, is unbounded escalations are just a nightmare to audit. If you loop in the admin by just saying, these are the permissions my app uses, it's so much easier to audit. They have a declarative set of tools. They can use exactly the same tools and skills that they're used to auditing anything else with.
And that's all of the technical questions. Sarah asked a housekeeping question, and are we going to be able to get access to the presentation deck? For starters, this meeting is being recorded. It's going to be posted within the week to YouTube, and all the meeting participants will have access to it. Well, everybody will have access to it. But regarding the deck, Daniel, Chris, your thoughts?
Slideshow?
You can't, because Salesforce has locked us down, so we can't share publicly anymore. I can export as a PDF.
Okay.
All right.
Just seeing the recording is good.
Are the recordings sufficient? Okay.
Yes.
I already deleted the speaker notes and PDF'd it, so I'll send that to John and Ohad so they can post it as well. But yeah, the recording will be up.
Awesome.
Okay.
And but that's all the questions that we have. Anybody else? If you have a question, feel free to take yourself off mute. Yeah, but yeah, silence is wonderful.
I'm kind of intrigued to see what happens when I push this button.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've got to go back to this and answer this question now.
Well, just to prove that those tests did in fact run. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so define data sample. Okay, so if I jump back to my test case where I added a data sample.
It should work, because when I talked to the DataWeave folks, they said they were actually killing off their experimental CLI in favor of moving everything to the language server.
It wants it here.
So I think.
So there is my semicolon separate. And what do I do? Just press run test.
I think you save it first and then, yeah, run mapping.
So where does my output go?
Now.
Run mapping. Oh, it's doing something. Oh.
It's doing something.
Unable to load label.
It might be the different folder structure. So
Yeah.
Daniel, we might have to follow up with the MuleSoft folks just because the folder structure is different. I don't know if they updated the language server to support our folder structure yet.
I'll make a note of that. That could be really useful though. So when people are developing Dataweave scripts for Apex, they can test them out locally.
That was one of the reasons the spec I handed you, and you were like, "Why is this folder structure so rigid? Why do we have to do it this way, Chris?" was so that
Yeah,
it would be
Chris.
on disk in a format that is compatible with what they're expecting. So that you could, so we could reuse the MuleSoft tools and not reinvent the wheel.
Okay. We'll follow up on that.
Yeah, the goal is to let you run DataWeave locally, so you don't have to deploy your Apex and then test it that way. You can test it against local files comfortably, do your fast local iterative developer loop, and then upload your DataWeave metadata once you have a script that you like.
Anybody got any other questions? All right. If that's the case, then I'll go ahead and stop the recording and we'll call it a night. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Chris, always a pleasure to see you as well. And let me stop the recording from here. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Someday I'm gonna have to go out in person and actually say hi to y'all.
Indeed. And